This man was one of the most evil serial killers in history.
He literally butchered his victims.
He was responsible for the murder of 5 prostitutes in the East End of London.
He was peculiar, he was narcissistic, and had a rich, sadistic fantasy life.
The crime scenes were so gruesome, they sickened even the toughest policemen.
There was a great mutilating gash down her abdomen.
He was somebody who wanted attention, who wanted recognition.
And the monster that lurked in the shadows of the dim, gaslit alleyways of Whitechapel was Jack the Ripper.
He knew the people, he knew the streets, and he was working on familiar territory in what modern serial killing terms is called the comfort zone.
He must have been someone who didn't stand out from the crowd.
The true identity of Jack the Ripper is something that we may never really know.
But what a name he'd created.
I think everybody likes a whodunit, and Jack the Ripper is the classic whodunit.
In 1888, London's East End was a squalid, unhealthy ghetto. For the ragged masses of urban poor who lived there, survival was a daily battle.
It was overcrowded, overpopulated, with 80 or possibly 90 people living in 3 rooms in a shabby lodging house. Unemployment, prostitution, disease, alcoholism, they were all rife.
This was a Skid Row of the metropolis. A terrible area of considerable slums and poverty.
You had the Ashkenazi Jews from Russia and Poland. You had a lot of Irish immigrants who'd come over with the potato famine. And it was a noisy, bustling area. It was a dirty and very, very violent area.
Nevertheless, ordinary people were unprepared for the horrors to come. The everyday violence of street brawls would be completely overshadowed by the maniacal torment of a madman. The 31st of August, 1888. A prostitute, Polly Nichols, roamed the streets of Whitechapel trying to make enough money to pay her rent. Instead, she met a grisly death. Her throat and abdomen were slashed wide open. The 8th of September. Just 8 days after the murder of Polly Nichols, a 47-year-old prostitute, Annie Chapman, met her own violent end. The 30th of September. 2 more streetwalkers, Elizabeth Stride and Catherine Eddowes, were killed in what became known as the double event. In early November, the murderer struck again, this time with grotesque violence. Prostitute Mary Kelly's mutilated body was discovered in her rented room. Her body was so badly chopped about, it was barely identifiable. A serial killer was on the loose, one who had the audacity to call himself Jack the Ripper. Exactly what type of person could commit these gruesome acts? Ever since the murders took place over a century ago, detectives, scientists, and psychologists have tried again and again to draw a profile of the sort of character Jack the Ripper could have been.
Jack the Ripper was probably someone who was around mid-20s to mid-30s. He was probably white. He certainly wouldn't have looked strange to an outside person. He would look fairly normal. He was somebody who wanted attention, who wanted recognition, and somebody who was very self-centered. But underneath the narcissism were very deep feelings of inadequacy. I wouldn't be surprised at all if Jack the Ripper was married, probably married to a woman either much older, much younger, or someone who is inadequate in some way, but somebody that he would feel totally dominant with.
However, in August 1888, the residents of Whitechapel were entirely unaware that a sadistic killer like this was lurking in their midst. Prostitutes continued to ply their trade in the dark streets and back alleys. Mary Ann Polly Nichols was among those unfortunate women. In the evening of the 31st of August, she was showing off a new hat to the owner of her boarding house. Behind with the rent, she drunkenly bragged that her jolly bonnet would soon earn her the sum owed. Polly set out into the night, oblivious to the terrible fate awaiting her.
At around 3:30 a.m. on August 31st, 1888, a carter named George Cross was walking along this East London thoroughfare, then called Bucks Row, when he spied a bundle lying in a gateway that stood here. Crossing to investigate, he saw it was the body of a woman. Within moments, another carter, Robert Paul, had joined him, and they decided to go and find a police officer. They came back with 3, one of whom, P.C. Neal, shone his bullseye lantern onto the woman, and the 5 men saw to their horror that her throat had been cut.
And when her body was removed to the mortuary, it was found that not only had her throat been cut almost to the bone, but there was a great mutilating gash down her abdomen. Now, if you like, that gash in itself was a clue to the personality of the killer. This wasn't just somebody robbing her and cutting her throat. There was something sick about the killer himself.
Polly Nichols was not the first prostitute to be murdered in Whitechapel in 1888. Earlier in the year, 2 others had also been killed. Although eventually ruled out as victims of the Ripper, the press instantly alluded to a connection between the crimes. On the morning of Nichols' death, the Star newspaper's headline blared out, "A revolting murder. Another woman found horribly mutilated in Whitechapel. Ghastly crimes by a maniac."
The press, they had a field day, to be honest. They reported every detail of the murders, and this fed a public fascination for what was going on.
The Star went on, "In each case, the victim has been a woman of abandoned character. Each of the ill-lighted thoroughfares to which the women were decoyed to be foully butchered are off-turnings from Whitechapel Road. The fact that these 3 tragedies are so strangely alike in their details is forcing on all minds the conviction that they are the work of some cool, cunning man with a mania for murder." The alarming similarities of the murders were not lost on the Metropolitan Police, and Scotland Yard was called in to investigate. They assigned one of their most seasoned detectives to the case, Inspector Frederick George Aberline.
He was up against a new kind of criminal, a criminal with a mentality that we now know as serial killers. These are people who are well organized, ruthless, cunning, and they seem to be able to get the devil's luck on their side, and that was certainly the case with this murderer.
Of 1888, Whitechapel in the East End of London was haunted by a vicious serial killer. Despite the heat, the men, women and children who lived in the capital's poorest area shivered in constant fear. A faceless, nameless butcher stalked their streets after dark. Polly Nichols was not the first prostitute murdered in Whitechapel. Earlier that year, 2 other streetwalkers met an equally violent end.
I think the main thing to remember about the Nichols murder is that the newspapers and the police suddenly thought, have we got a repeat killer on our hands here? And it was immediately associated with the previous murders of Emma Smith and Martha Tabram, which probably weren't related at all, but it was certainly in the press that there may be a maniac at large.
So great was the fear that rewards were offered in the hope that the killer could be apprehended as a result. L&P Walter and Sons of Spitalfields, clothing manufacturers, wrote to the Home Office asking for a reward to be offered in exchange for information leading to the arrest of the murderer. Much to public dismay, the government rejected the request out of hand.
Rewards had in fact been offered by the Metropolitan Police and others at various times in the past, and the policy had been discontinued because it was felt the offering of rewards encouraged people to give false information in the hope of getting the reward.
Down in the murky streets of the East End, Inspector Frederick Aberline of Scotland Yard and Inspector Edmund Reed of the Whitechapel Division, along with their men, searched methodically for the killer.
While violence was commonplace in the East End, this type of murder was very unusual, and the police were ill-equipped by experience or training to be able to deal with it. And I think what they were up against was this well-organized murderer who probably lived and worked locally, and he had the knack of speedily removing himself from the crime scene and thereby avoiding capture and making good his escape.
If you look at the Jack the Ripper cases, these were planned to a large degree. The offender brought a murder weapon with him. He didn't use a weapon of opportunity, and no one ever recovered any murder weapons.
The detectives were locked into a desperate race to catch their man before he killed again. And they were not the only ones in the hunt. On the 5th of September, the Star named its prime suspect, a ne'er-do-well known as Leather Apron.
A great scare began about somebody called Leather Apron. Leather Apron was supposed to threaten the local prostitutes and extort money from them at knife point, and a number of the prostitutes thought that this man may well have been the Ripper.
The real point, of course, is that it was known that Leather Apron was Jewish, and it had nearly started anti-Semitic rioting with the suggestion that a Jew was committing these murders.
Even as tension grew to fever pitch and the search for Leather Apron intensified, the killer struck again on the 8th of September, just before dawn. The victim was a 47-year-old prostitute called Annie Chapman.
This was in the backyard of 29 Hanbury Street, and of course there was severe mutilation. He totally opened the abdominal cavity. Her genitals were on her shoulder. He'd removed the womb and taken it away with him, cut her throat, and it was a very unpleasant sight.
He has to mutilate the body, and when he does it in a repetitive, ritualistic way, he more or less leaves his signature or his calling card.
But this time, the police had an eyewitness, Mrs. Long, a local resident.
Mrs. Long, who identified Chapman as a woman she'd seen standing talking to a man at 29 Hanbury Street, described the man as a little taller than the woman, and Chapman was 5 feet tall. He looked foreign. We don't know why she thought he looked foreign. And she also heard him say to the woman, "Will you?" And she replied, "Yes." And there's a further descriptive passage in the local press of the time, which didn't appear in the police reports, that he was wearing a long overcoat and a deerstalker hat.
In addition to Mrs. Long's account, a leather apron was found lying in the backyard of 29 Hanbury Street. 2 days later, Sergeant William Thick of the Metropolitan Police arrested boot finisher John Pizer, the man reputed to be Leather Apron. The police fought their way through an angry mob as they led Pizer into the station for questioning. Cries of "murderer" rang through the air.
I think to satisfy the public clamour that Leather Apron should be arrested, the police apprehended John Pizer. At least they appeared to be doing something.
Now, Pizer had a dodgy record. He had attacked a man with a knife the previous year, and he was charged with indecent assault on a prostitute shortly before the murders began.
Under questioning, Pizer denied that he had ever been referred to as Leather Apron. Sergeant Thick contradicted this, saying he had known him for 18 years and he was definitely the man known by that name. But eventually, Pizer provided a credible alibi and was released. The leather apron found in the yard proved to be a red herring as well. It belonged to someone who lived nearby. Adding to Scotland Yard's frustration, several other suspects brought in and interrogated were cleared of suspicion.
And serious historians recognize that, given the limitations of forensic science, which was effectively non-existent at the time, the police really did as good a job as one could reasonably expect.
The police put detectives in disguise on the streets, just trying to look the part, wearing patches, walking sticks, anything to make them not look like a detective.
In fact, the joke on the streets was that whatever the policemen dressed up in, they always kept their big boots on and so gave themselves away.
That's not the only factor, because, of course, policemen, on the whole, are fairly big, robust men. So I think even putting plain clothes on them didn't disguise their, their true calling.
The wide extent of police action was evidence of the terror the killer had unleashed on the streets of Whitechapel. There was enormous public anxiety, and no attempt to unmask the killer seemed too absurd. By September, dozens of additional detectives and policemen had been moved into the East End. They were joined by members of the newly formed Whitechapel Vigilance Committee, founded by a local builder, George Lusk. The police continued to haul in dozens of suspects from all over the East End. Inspector Aberline favored Joseph Eisenschmidt, a mad Swedish butcher, as the principal suspect. At the inquest for Annie Chapman, Coroner Wynne Baxter concluded that the killer had surgical expertise based upon the extent of the mutilations and the fact that Chapman's uterus was missing.
The main theories thrown out at the time were that the Ripper might be a butcher or a doctor. This was because some of the medical men examining the bodies thought that he showed some anatomical knowledge. One of them thought he showed actual real skill. One should add immediately that others thought he showed no skill whatever.
The butcher theory has some merit, I think, because especially on account of the throat cutting. And that, for me, has resonance with the kind of skill used by a slaughterman. And in the case of the murder victims, it is likely that they were forced to the ground, and then with a single slash of the knife, their throats were cut back to the bone.
While speculation about the killer's identity raged unabated, the possible culprit himself obviously grew restless. He wrote 2 letters. The first, dated the 25th of September, arrived at the Central News Agency on the 27th.
Dear boss, I keep hearing the police have caught me, but they won't fix me just yet. The next job I do, I shall clip the lady's ears off and send to the police officers just for jolly. Wouldn't you? Yours truly, Jack the Ripper.
The fiend had acquired a name.
The senior police at the time thought that the letters were the work of a journalist who wanted to keep the story going. Most serious scholars today are quite sure that these letters did not come from the murderer. But what a name he'd created, Jack the Ripper.
As the police frantically hunted for Jack the Ripper, the people of Whitechapel tried to carry on with their lives. However, the killer had other plans for some of them. In his communication to the Central News Agency on the 27th of September, the Ripper bragged with relish, "My knife's so nice and sharp, I want to get to work right away."
Without a doubt, Jack the Ripper wanted to take complete credit for all of the murders, and that's why he sent letters to the police describing the murders themselves. He wanted to offend the police, he wanted to shock the police, and he actually achieved that.
The murders had stunned the community, but the Ripper was about to shock the EastEnders even more horribly.
At 1 a.m. on the 30th of September, a carter named Louis Dimschutz pulled his cart into the backyard of the Polish and Jewish Working Men's Club, number 30, Berner Street, on the site now occupied by this school. As he did so, his pony sheared up with alarm and pulled away to the right. Dimschutz climbed down to see what had disturbed the beast and discovered the body of Jack the Ripper's 3rd victim, Elizabeth Stride.
She'd only had her throat cut, and the argument for her being a Ripper victim is the killer was disturbed by the arrival of the witness Dimschutz in his horse and cart, and the killer then made his way off without carrying out any further mutilation. I don't think Stride was a Ripper victim, but I can't prove that.
Police officers arrived quickly and immediately launched an intensive search of the area. They feared the murderer might still be lurking nearby in the shadows. But even as they were scouring the streets of Whitechapel, new horrific events were about to unfold less than a mile away in the heart of the city.
1:45 a.m. on the morning of the 30th of September, 1888, P.C. Watkins of the City Police turned into Mitre Square. With his bullseye lantern, he began to move around the corners of the square. When the beam illuminated the spot just over here, he saw a bundle, approached it, and stumbled upon the body of Catherine Eddowes, Jack the Ripper's 4th victim.
And here is where we see him getting horribly into his stride. Some very detailed post-mortem obsessive activity attacking the face.
He took their organs out, and he did so in a very methodical way and a very brutal way that really shocked the conscience of the entire community, even the police force at that time.
He nicked both eyes, he put V-shaped cuts on her cheek. The tip of her nose was cut off, she had a diagonal slash across her right cheek, and part of one of her earlobes had been detached and fell off. The abdomen was totally opened up, intestines removed. He took away with him the left kidney and the uterus.
He probably wasn't fully satisfied, fully gratified with the first killing for one reason or another, and wanted to do it again. And he felt perhaps that he could do it again because of the circumstances that presented themselves at that time.
For the first time since the murders began, the police found some significant clues in Goulston Street in the East End.
One is a piece of apron, and this is important because it was a piece of Catherine Eddowes' apron. And he'd used it to wipe his hands on. It was covered with blood and mess from inside her body.
Several witnesses who had seen both women just prior to their deaths came forward to give evidence. Israel Schwartz, a Hungarian immigrant, saw a man assault Elizabeth Stride just minutes before her throat was slit. Schwartz went on to describe the assailant as a man 5'5" tall with dark hair and clothes, a small brown moustache and a peaked cap. Meanwhile, there was also a male witness in the Catherine Eddowes case. He saw a man with Eddowes who appeared a far cry from the dapper stranger associated with the image of Jack the Ripper today.
If Jack the Ripper was walking around Whitechapel section of London at that time, he would have fit in completely.
If you mention that name, Jack the Ripper, to anybody, it conjures up this image of a man in a top hat carrying a Gladstone bag, stalking the shadows, looking for his unsuspecting prey. That isn't what he would have looked like. If anybody like that had approached the prostitutes at the height of the panic, then they would have screamed out and attracted attention.
We know from the descriptions that he wore a peaked cap or hat, that he probably wore a pea jacket and a loosely tied scarf round his neck. If anything, he'd have had something of the appearance of a seaman.
We're talking about someone who can commit a murder and then lose himself in streets where you have anything up to 10,000 people walking through those streets. And to have done that, he must have been someone who didn't stand out from the crowd.
I think he lived locally because the speed with which he escaped from the crime scene, even when the area was intensely patrolled by police. If he were a slaughterman, then he could have escaped from the crime scene to his place of work.
How was the Ripper able to complete such extensive and gory mutilations, yet escape without being covered in blood? Detective Edmund Reed later described his frustration at the killer's cunning modus operandi.
The position of the blood in the body showed that he had slashed her throat with his right hand from right to left, causing the blood to spurt away from him, so that he probably never had any blood stains on his clothes. One of the great difficulties of the case for the police was that it was a case of a maniac's cunning outwitting reason's methods.
Jack the Ripper could have easily brought a change of clothes with him. It was noted, at least by one eyewitness, that a person at the crime scene around that time was carrying a big bag with him.
On the morning after the double murder, the Central News Agency received an insolent postcard from Jack the Ripper. It was penned in red ink, and the handwriting matched that of the previous correspondence. It is believed that it was written on the 30th of September, the day of the double murder.
I was not codding, dear old boss, when I gave you the tip. You'll hear about Saucy Jackie's work tomorrow. Double event this time. Number one squealed a bit, couldn't finish it straight off. Had not time to get ears for police. Thanks for keeping last letter back till I got to work again. Jack the Ripper.
If you look at the letters as a whole, the letters themselves are very interesting. The letters are taunting the police. Certainly the letter writing would be consistent with the type of personality outlined before. Someone who's narcissistic, who wants attention, who wants to show how smart he is, that wants to taunt the police that he, Jack the Ripper, is in control and not members of law enforcement.
On the same day the communication arrived at the Central News Agency, the Lord Mayor of London offered a £500 reward for information leading to the conviction of Catherine Eddowes' killer. He received nearly 1,400 tip-offs. Meanwhile, fear of the Ripper persuaded many prostitutes to abandon their nocturnal pursuits. Scotland Yard increased the number of men on patrol from 27 to 89. No two policemen were further than 15 minutes from each other as they trod their beats. Copies of the Ripper's 2 letters were published and posted throughout the East End in the hope that someone would recognize the handwriting. On the 16th of October, George Lusk, leader of the Citizens' Whitechapel Vigilance Committee, received a mysterious parcel in the post.
It was a small cardboard box containing half a human kidney longitudinally divided, and a letter from hell stating it was half the kidney he'd taken from one of the women, which he had preserved. It wasn't signed with any name, it just said, "Catch me when you can."
The one letter that some experts today think might be genuine is the Lusk letter. But the kidney is really another of the slightly grey areas. For a long time, we all thought it was a hoax. But more recently, Nick Warren, the editor of Ripperana, who is himself a surgeon, has looked closely at the medical report on Catherine Eddowes, and there are medical reasons for thinking that this kidney could have come from Catherine Eddowes.
Even as Lusk was opening the grim package, Scotland Yard and city police officers brought in over 80 suspects for questioning and followed up hundreds of leads. But weeks passed by with no arrests. Over time, public fear abated a little, and many of the 1,200 East End whores went back to work. This development played right into the hands of Saucy Jackie, a fact lamented by Chief Inspector Henry Moore, a colleague of Frederick Aberline.
What makes it so easy for him is that the women lead him of their own free will to the spot where they know interruption is least likely. It's not as if he had to wait for his chance. They make the chance for him.
By October 1888, Jack the Ripper had claimed 4 victims in his murderous rampage, and it wasn't over. His first 4 victims displayed striking similarities. All were cheap streetwalkers in their 40s who loved a good drink. Mary Jane Kelly was not like them, although she did work as a prostitute in the East End. The attractive 25-year-old woman entertained her clients in the relative safety of a boarding house in Miller's Court. Her rent was well overdue, so she carried on despite a murderer being on the loose. In the early morning hours of the 9th of November, a man carrying a parcel, and who was later described as foreign-looking with a carroty moustache, entered Mary Jane Kelly's room. A couple of hours later, neighbors reported hearing a cry of murder, but no one dared investigate.
At 10 o'clock in the morning on the 9th of November, 1888, a rent collector turned into Dorset Street, now obliterated by these modern developments. He turned into Miller's Court and knocked on the door of the ground floor room. He got no reply. He pulled aside a curtain that covered a broken window pane and discovered the body of Mary Kelly, Jack the Ripper's final victim.
The Mary Kelly murder was particularly gruesome because the murderer literally ripped her to pieces, whereas previous victims had been murdered on the street. In this instance, he was invited into Kelly's room, and once he was alone with her and had closed the door behind him, then of course he could do anything he wanted.
Her organs were spread all over the bed, lumps of flesh on the bedside table, her thighs were cut down to the thigh bone, the face had virtually been totally removed. If any organ was removed and taken away in the case of Kelly, it was just the heart, and not, as with the other previous 2, the uterus. It was just a terrible sight.
Certainly with Mary Kelly, he had a lot more time. There seems to be an escalation of behavior from just strangling and cutting their throat to stabbing multiple times, ripping them open, and then total disemboweling.
At least 5 women had died at the hands of the Ripper. A distraught Queen Victoria telegraphed the Prime Minister urging some very decided action. The cabinet authorized a pardon for anyone who came forward as an accomplice of the butcher of Mary Kelly. Meanwhile, Scotland Yard again increased the number of its patrols from 89 to 143 men. But this action proved to be too little, too late, for the killings mysteriously ceased. Or did they?
There can be no doubt that the murders stopped, either because the murderer died, or he was arrested, incarcerated, or prevented from moving by some other cause, or just possibly because he moved somewhere else and his renewed murders were never noted. There is no other reason why this type of murderer stops.
Eventually, the Metropolitan Police reduced their patrols as the havoc wreaked by the Ripper dissipated and life in the slums of the East End returned to normal. or so it seemed.
It's a common fallacy that the murders ceased after November 1888 because, of course, we have the murder of Alice Mackenzie on the 17th of July 1889. And the final Whitechapel murders victim was Francis Coles on the 13th of February 1891.
Could it be that Jack the Ripper returned after a 7-month respite from his bloodthirsty rampage? This theory was endorsed by Inspector Edmund Reed of the Metropolitan Police.
Inspector Reed seemed to think that Mackenzie and Coles were in fact also Ripper victims.
Despite Reed's views, these murders, although violent, lacked the sadistic characteristics of the earlier crimes. Some people close to the subject suggest they were the work of a copycat killer.
It's unlikely, I would think, that any of those subsequent crimes were the work of the Ripper.
The police were divided as to the exact number of women the Ripper actually slaughtered, a debate that continues today among historians.
No one knows for certain how many murders there were. Depending on your choice of authority, the number ranges anywhere between 4 and about 18.
I don't think there's anything unusual in there being uncertainty about the number of victims we can ascribe to any one serial killer. My own belief is that Jack the Ripper killed between 4 and 6 women.
In my opinion, he probably killed more than that. And I say that because it's very hard to stop this on your own.
Most so-called experts plump for 5, and they are Nichols, which was the 31st of August 1888, through Annie Chapman, Stride, Eddowes, and the final victim being Mary Kelly.
But even more controversial than the number of victims attributed to Jack the Ripper is the identity of the man himself. In 1894, a memorandum written by Sir Melville Macnaghten, Assistant Chief Constable of Scotland Yard's Criminal Investigation Department, appeared in the Sun newspaper.
He penned a document naming 3 people he thought were likely suspects: Druitt, Ostrog and Kosminski. This 1894 mention is the first mention we find of those names in connection with the murders.
Druitt was a school teacher and barrister. He committed suicide at the end of 1888, shortly after the murder of Mary Kelly. Apparently feared that he was going insane. We have absolutely no knowledge or idea of why he ever became a candidate for being the Ripper, other than the fact that Macnaghten says the family thought that he was possibly the murderer.
The second suspect was believed to be Aaron Kosminski, a Polish Jewish hairdresser who was declared legally insane in 1888. Sir Robert Anderson, head of the CID, stated that a reliable witness positively identified this man as the murderer. But in the end, claims that he had a hatred of women and strong homicidal tendencies proved unfounded, and Kosminski is now ruled out as a suspect by most Ripperologists. Macnaghten's third and final suspect was Michael Ostrog, a Russian confidence trickster who had passed himself off as everything from a surgeon to a priest.
Ostrog, I think we can fairly safely dismiss. He was a much older man. He was a con man and a petty thief and was probably in France at the time of the murders.
Macnaghten and Anderson were but 2 of the scores of men with a vested interest in solving the Whitechapel murders. What about the detectives in the field? Who did they suspect? In 1903, long-retired detective Frederick Abberline favored George Chapman, a man who was convicted of poisoning his 3 wives.
Abberline believed that if you were wicked enough to poison your wives, you were clearly wicked enough to be Jack the Ripper. Well, wicked enough may be, but psychologically, they're totally different types of crime, and Chapman clearly was not Jack the Ripper.
Abberline then conceded that Scotland Yard is really no wiser on the subject than it was 15 years ago. When an American journalist visited the Yard's crime museum in the early 1900s, he asked why there were no relics of the Ripper murders. The detective conducting the tour replied, "There is no more of a clue to that chap's identity than there is to the identity of some murderer who will kill someone 100 years from now." Over 100 years since the Ripper claimed his final victim, the issue remains a national obsession.
year after year, books come out and theories come out, and each year you'll think, we've caught him, that's definitely him, that's convinced me. And then you'll read the next book and think, oh, that could be him as well.
The hunt for Jack the Ripper is no longer carried out on the streets of the East End. Now, instead, men and women seeking his true identity spend countless hours sifting through thousands of documents in libraries and archives all around the world. In 1988, John Douglas, a former agent and profiler from the American FBI's Behavioral Science Unit, attempted to reconstruct Jack the Ripper's personality. Douglas believes that the Ripper mutilated animals as a child, worked as a butcher or mortuary attendant, was plagued by paranoia, and probably carried a knife for protection. Douglas also guessed that the Ripper lived or worked very near the location of his first murder, and that he harbored a great hatred for women, especially prostitutes.
I think Jack the Ripper was a person consistent with what we know about the persona of modern serial killers, probably an individual of low esteem, seeking revenge, perhaps, against the world, and doing this by killing the people that made easy targets.
Psychologically speaking, we're talking about someone who was very much in control of his emotions to begin with, but then this bloodlust, this need to murder. Motive-wise, there's no motive. He does it for the satisfaction of the murders.
In 1992, a journal surfaced supposedly written by Jack the Ripper. The real author was James Maybrick, a Liverpool cotton broker who died in 1889. Numerous experts were called in to ascertain the document's authenticity.
There's no information in the Maybrick diary which is in any way significant, there's nothing there which tells us anything or provides us with any additional information, which is one of the reasons why so many people initially considered it was a forgery anyway.
Year after year, the public is deluged with bizarre Jack the Ripper theories, ranging from speculation that he was Queen Victoria's grandson, Prince Albert, to a suggestion that the crimes were the work of the secretive Order of Freemasons.
There's really no evidence of that at all. It's really totally nothing but speculation.
I think the case has produced a huge number of suspects simply because there is this desire to identify the Ripper. And I think, you know, when there's not a real suspect, then sometimes they get manufactured.
In 1993, Ripper historian Stuart Evans made a sensational discovery. It was an 80-year-old letter written by Chief Inspector John George Littlechild, head of Special Branch at Scotland Yard.
I found the Littlechild letter naming a brand new suspect that nobody had ever heard of before. And that was Dr. Tumblety, the quack American doctor.
Though court records of the time indicate that Tumblety was arrested on the 7th of November for gross indecency with a male, it's just possible that he was released in time to have murdered Mary Jane Kelly 2 days later on the 9th. A week and a half later, Tumblety jumped bail and fled to America.
Scotland Yard officers pursued him to New York, so they obviously felt there was something a bit more serious than the misdemeanor of gross indecency.
Tumblety eluded his pursuers and was never captured. Though much of his private life is cloaked in mystery, the not-so-good doctor remains a prime suspect today.
I think if I had to give my own opinion on what the Ripper looked like, I would paint a picture of a person similar to Tumblety, who was a great misogynist. He hated prostitutes. He got an anatomical collection, if the stories are to be believed in the States, of wounds in glass jars. He's got all the prerequisites, and I think Tumblety is the right sort of man.
As with almost every other facet of the investigation, there is controversy about Tumblety's viability as a suspect, largely because of his alleged homosexuality.
Now, homosexual serial killers kill other men. They don't kill women. In the case of the Ripper, we are definitely looking for a heterosexual, not for someone like Dr. Tumblety.
Dr. Tumblety is an unlikely suspect, in my view. He was described as a tall, rather lanky man with effeminate ways, which earned him the nickname of Miss Francis. He also wore a flamboyant moustache, and this is shown in most of the photographs of him. A most unlikely character to be seen in the East End. He would have stuck out like a sore thumb.
If not Tumblety, then who are the prime suspects today?
I think it's likely that our murderer was a man who by occupation was a slaughterman, who was familiar with the area. He knew the people, he knew the streets, and he was working on familiar territory in what, in modern serial killing terms, is called the comfort zone.
I believe that Jack the Ripper was probably a man who was put into the asylum under the name of David Cohen by the police. Now, he goes in at precisely the right time for the murders to stop. He is a poor foreign immigrant Jew from Whitechapel, and he is the most violent man to appear in the asylum over the next 2 years.
My own personal opinion is that it was someone who, as many of the police officers who worked on the case say, was just an ordinary Polish Jewish immigrant living in the heart of the neighborhood.
I think the idea that it was a foreigner is probably more politically motivated than scientifically motivated. I mean, any time there is something horrific that happens in one's community or country, the first people that are suspected are people that are different than the particular makeup of the community.
The true identity of Jack the Ripper is something that we may never really know, but it's very difficult to say that with any certainty because so much has happened over the last few years.
In his research on the murders, historian Neil Stubbings has made a new discovery. In 2001, he uncovered what is believed to be the only known photograph of one of the victims taken prior to her death. In this rarely seen picture, Annie Chapman is shown with her husband John on their wedding day in 1869, 19 years before her death. In 2003, the famous crime novelist Patricia Cornwell joined in the search for Jack. In a widely publicized novel, she identified him as the illustrious painter Walter Sickert.
What makes Patricia Cornwell's analysis so compelling is that she combined not only forensic science, but combined it with psychological science, behavioral science, and a great deal of common sense. When you look at all of the elements of the Jack the Ripper case and look at the life, background, and behavior of Walter Sickert, it really seems to fit.
In May 2006, one of the most extraordinary allegations in the Ripper saga surfaced in Australia. Professor Ian Findlay ran DNA tests on the remaining physical evidence and suggested that the killer may have been a woman.
The idea that Jack the Ripper was really Jill the Ripper, I think, is incorrect, and the odds of that are just astronomical. These are all men who kill women, sexually motivated serial killers.
Scientists and policemen may still be obsessed with Jack the Ripper, and they are certainly not alone. Hollywood has made a mint out of the public fascination with the elusive murderer.
In the Hollywood film From Hell, Johnny Depp played the part of Inspector Abberline, and Michael Caine played the role of Inspector Abberline in the British TV series. So the interest in this subject is unflagging.
After all this time, is it possible we may one day learn the true identity of the Ripper?
There are reputable historians and criminologists working on the background to these murders, and it is from their work that we may find the clues that will help us to progress a resolution to these murders. It's unlikely, but history teaches us we should keep an open mind. It is just possible that there's some nugget of undiscovered information that might come to light.
But until we are absolutely sure, the mystery will continue to fuel the alluring, salacious legend of this Victorian murderer.
I think everybody likes a whodunit, and Jack the Ripper is the classic whodunit.
I keep hearing the police have caught me, but they won't fix me just yet. Yours truly, Jack the Ripper.